Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many people here. My name is Thomas Berman. I'm the director of the Medieval Institute here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm happy to welcome so many people on this Halloween afternoon for our annual Mathews Lecture. Every year, usually in the fall, an endowment allows us to offer the Constantine Mathews Lecture. This endowment was set up by Father Constantine Mathews' sons in honor of their father. Father Mathews is a Greek Orthodox priest, now retired, who actually studied here at Notre Dame and did a master's degree here. And we're grateful to have the resources then to offer this lecture every year in his honor. I'm going to call up to the podium now my colleague, Father Alexis Torrance from the Theology Department, who will introduce our speaker this year. Father Alexis.
Thank you, Tom. It brings me great joy to be able to welcome a near neighbor this time from Marquette, and also a dear friend, Professor Marcus Plested, for this year's Mathews Lecture. Professor Plested his first degree was in history, and then he pursued graduate degrees in theology, all at Merton College, Oxford, and his doctorate was supervised by the late, great Orthodox theologian Kallistos Ware. He taught for many years at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge before being scooped up by the Jesuits at Marquette. I believe 12 years ago, almost, must be 2013. He is a professor there of Greek patristic and Byzantine, or as he prefers to say, Byzantine theology, but also we could add modern Orthodox theology. He's also held prestigious fellowships, the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and his work has ranged across patristic, Byzantine, and modern Orthodox theology. Some people write good and timely books. There are a few people who really write the books that need to be written, and Marcus is one of those scholars. His first book was on the Macarian legacy, the legacy of Macarius of Egypt, which I think helped settle a lot of anxieties about whether Macarius was Massalian or the Macarian corpus was somehow tainted. It's a beautiful examination of that corpus and its reception, particularly in the Eastern Christian tradition. And then he got even more timely with Orthodox readings of Aquinas. That is the reception of Thomas Aquinas in the Byzantine East and in modern Orthodox discourse a must-read. He also co-edited the Oxford Handbook for the Reception of Aquinas in general, not just in the East, and more recently published another must-read monograph on wisdom in the Christian tradition. That is something particularly important in modern Orthodox theology, the role of wisdom, Sophia, and sophiology. And he sort of lets us know what we need to know about the patristic roots of modern Russian sophiology. Now, he's also preparing another book that needs to be written, and that is on the theology of history in Byzantium and Orthodoxy more broadly speaking. Today he will focus, I think, on Byzantium, and the title of his talk is "Upon Whom the Ends of the Ages Have Come: Byzantine Perspectives on the Theology of History." Please join me in welcoming Professor Plested to the podium.
Lovely. Thank you, Father Alexis, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to everyone involved with the Medieval Institute for this invitation to deliver the Mathews Lecture in Byzantine Christianity. It's wonderful to be, well, back here, and not today. I have spoken to Dame a couple of times before, and it's always a great pleasure to be here in this tremendously august institution. And yes, Byzantine Perspectives on the Theology of History. I'll begin with a quote: "That no one be so mad as to believe that there's anything more pleasurable than history." I'm sure everybody here will agree with this sentiment. And it goes back to Nicetas Choniates, a historian of the 12th and early 13th centuries, who chronicled some very painful and actually rather unpleasurable times, including the sack of Constantinople, 1204. But in lauding the salutary and educative character of history, Nicetas was, of course, transcending the pains and pleasures of particular historical events and pointing to something rather more significant. And it's this larger significance of human history that I want to talk about this evening. And this larger significance requires me to leave Byzantium for a moment and to plunge briefly into the realms of modern theology, but be assured we'll be soon back in the Byzantine realm in accordance with the chief remit of this lecture series. So Christianity is a uniquely historical religion, the only religion to hold that the causal principle of the universe entered human history as human and was born, died, and rose again. This entry of the infinite into the finite, the eternal into the temporal, makes history a central and inescapable locus of Christian theology. Indeed, this question of the theology of history is in a sense commensurate with Christian theology as a whole, in that the question of the theology of history consists in an extended exploration of the implications of the fact that the Logos, who is Theos, the Word who is God, has taken flesh and dwelt among us. From John 1, of course. Christians have always been alive to the historical dimensions of their faith, even at the height of their anticipation of an imminent eschaton in the earliest years of the nascent church. As heirs to the sacred history of Israel, denizens of the Roman Empire, and whether they liked it or not, immersed in the thought world of Greek philosophy, Christians united in themselves the archetypal cities of Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. But as sons and daughters of the New Covenant, they also partook of a wholly new understanding and experience of history that both consummated and transcended all existing Greek, Roman, and Jewish notions of time, space, and the historical process. And Christian reflection on the meaning and purpose of human history has always been bound up with the history of salvation, what the Germans called Heilsgeschichte. The question of the theology of history in its modern sense, however, is very much a reaction to the emergence of a sphere of philosophy of history detached from salvation history in the 18th century and operating on strictly rational principles in people like Vico and Voltaire. And this approach reached a kind of apogee in the philosophy of Hegel, in which all human history, including all its suffering and apparent pointlessness, is construed in terms of the progressive unfolding of the absolute. and later broadly positivistic iterations of the philosophy of history tended towards the detection of universal principles lying behind the rise and fall of particular civilizations and societies, such as in the very popular work of Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee. So focus on this question, the theology of history, is also a response to the emergence of history as a discrete academic discipline with a definite scientific methodology in the late 18th century, something that again owes a great deal to the Germans. And this phenomenon, of course, has presented some challenges to Christian theology, while also being itself severely challenged in subsequent generations, and for example in different ways by Schleiermacher and Dilthey. But what I want to emphasize this evening is particularly in the 20th century that the theology of history emerged as an especially fertile area of theological inquiry. Against the background of the earth-shattering events of the 20th century, virtually all the greats of Protestant and Catholic systematic and philosophical theology have grappled with the theological problematic of history. And here I'm thinking of figures like Barth, Pannenberg, Lerwith on the Protestant side, and Danielou, de Lubac, Ratzinger, von Balthasar, Maritain amongst the Catholics. In terms of the theology of history, I think there's a basic difference between approaches that effectively dismiss the historical process as irrelevant, subordinating it to the blinding light of biblical revelation and the salvation of particular humans, and those who want to find some sort of meaning and purpose to the historical process. At the risk of some oversimplification, we can talk about this later, I'd suggest that Catholic theologians have tended to the former approach, and Catholic theologians have tended to the latter approach, i.e. some sort of meaning and purpose, and Protestants to the latter, subordinating history, seeing it as irrelevant. We can talk about that, as I say. For example, the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth decried the all-conquering monotony of human history, an endless sequence of violence, self-interest, exploitation, injustice. Similar sentiments are found in Karl Lerwith, who authored a seminal book, Meaning in History, and was fond of quoting in this context Goethe, who dismissed history as the most absurd of all things, a web of nonsense for the higher thinker. I'm sure you don't think that sort of thing here at the Medieval Institute. In the latter camp, those seeking some sort of higher purpose, some goal to history, we can put Hans Urs von Balthasar, great Catholic theologian, who argues that any attempt to interpret history as a whole, if it's not to succumb to Gnostic myth, must posit some subject which works in and reveals itself in the whole of history, and is at the same time a being capable of providing general norms. So for von Balthasar, as you might expect, such a being can neither be God alone or an individual human being, only Jesus Christ as both God and man. But what's striking about all these theologies of history is the extent to which, insofar as they deal with patristic theologies of history, they're almost totally dominated by Augustine, perhaps peppered with some later Western figures. Of course, Greek exemplars do crop up from time to time in these narratives. For example, Eusebius for purposes of contrast with Augustine, or enrichment, and here I think of von Balthasar's use of Irenaeus, but never in a way that challenges seriously the Augustinian ascendancy. And of course, St. Augustine's compelling vision of history as the perennial contention between two entirely incommensurate cities, the earthly city and the city of God, must be given its due account in patristic views of history. So I'm not proposing an anti-Augustinian theology of history, but rather seeking to listen to his theology of history within a broader patristic and Byzantine chorus. The problem is, in most Catholic and Protestant theologies of history, as I say, that Augustine's is virtually the only patristic voice one hears. That's expressed very clearly by Karl Lerwith, who I mentioned a moment ago, who says that Augustine's city of God is the pattern of every conceivable view of history that can rightly be called Christian. So all Christian theologies of history, in other words, must acknowledge the radical contingency and utter irrelevancy of merely historical events, along with the strictly limited capacity for the good in any and all human societies. Yes, there's a role for human history under God's providence, but it's chiefly through the pedagogy of human suffering and misery. And by extension, and here I go beyond Lerwith, all Christian theologies of history, following Augustine, must acknowledge that human history operates under the conditions of the fall, as envisioned by Augustine, and so with no room for human agency oriented to the good, except as enabled by divine grace. So R.G. Collingwood, who's one of the greatest, I think, modern philosophers of history, also himself an archaeologist and historian, as well as a philosopher, spoke of the Christian conception of history in these terms. So all human achievements, he says, are due not to their own proper forces of human will and intellect, but to something other than ourselves, causing us to desire ends that are worth pursuing. So man behaves, says Collingwood, from the point of view of the historian, as if he were the wise architect of his own fortunes. But the wisdom displayed in his own action is not his, it's the wisdom of God, by whose grace man's desires are directed to worthy ends. And Collingwood adds, this conception of grace is the correlative of the conception of original sin. So you see the very heavy Augustinian framework within which so much modern philosophy and theology of history operates. Now, the Augustinian understanding of original sin and grace, of course, stands in some contrast to a more typical Greek patristic understanding, in which some limited but real scope is allowed for human agency even after the fall, according to the prevailing paradigm of synergia, or cooperation, between divine grace and human freedom. So Collingwood goes on to talk about Western historiography as being concerned not really with human deeds, but with the gesta Dei, the works of God. In short, in Collingwood, as in much Protestant and Catholic work on the theology of history, the Greek, patristic and Byzantine idea of history is almost absent. The same can be said for even perhaps the most brilliant contemporary thinker on the question of history, Hans-Georg Gadamer. Responding to the modern crisis of confidence in the claims of reason, science, interpretation, Gadamer evoked the ineluctable embeddedness of being in historical time, something that underpins his very fruitful understanding of tradition. Gadamer much admired Collingwood and developed some of his key insights. But insofar as Gadamer engages with patristic testimony, and of course that's not his main purpose, but insofar as he does talk about the fathers, it's almost always Augustine he talks about on numerous topics. And indeed he'll sometimes leap straight from Augustine to scholasticism, to the Reformation, to the Counter-Reformation, as if that summed up the whole Christian tradition. So I'm not singling out Gadamer here as a bad guy, and he's somebody I need to dive further into, but I think he's just typical of the fact that almost the whole of modern thinking on the question of history, insofar as it has drawn on patristic sources, has been almost entirely limited by Augustine. And what are the Orthodox? Do they do any better? Well, here I'm thinking of two of the main figures of modern Orthodox theology, Father George Florovsky and Father Sergius Bulgakov, both heavily invested in articulating an Orthodox theology of history. And Bulgakov's struggle was really to square his vision of the transcendent reality of divine Sophia with earthly complexities. And he saw human history as, with all its suffering and pain and misery, nonetheless as an unfolding, a revelation over time of God's own wisdom, even to the point of embracing a tangible but a definite form of earthly millenarianism. And Florovsky's work similarly is shaped by a distinctive understanding of the nature of history and the historical process. So in his famous essay, or famous in some circles anyway, The Predicament of the Christian Historian, he says Christianity is basically a vigorous appeal to history, a witness of faith to certain particular events in the past, to certain particular data of history. And indeed the difference between Bulgakov and Florovsky can be construed precisely in terms of their approach to history, their theologies of history. So for Florovsky, the idea that all human history is the unfolding of divine wisdom was deterministic, i.e. to erase human freedom, crudely eschatological, and affected by far too much German idealism, especially from Hegel and Schelling. So for Florovsky, it's a form of historicism, in which the underlying forces, shape the pattern of human history, thereby extinguishing human agency. And it's been remarked by Rowan Williams that this particular essay, Predicament of the Christian Historian, is the key to Florovsky's whole project, his whole neo-patristic project, despite the fact that it mentions no patristic authorities. It's all conducted within the framework of the modern Western intellectual tradition, talking about people like Dilthey, Croce, Royce, Speth, and others, and pointing out, as Father Matthew Baker in his the late Father Matthew Baker's unfinished PhD thesis, which I've been able to look at, Many of his concerns anticipate those of Gadamer, rather interestingly. Now, Bulgakov's work on history is similarly conducted within the framework of the modern Western intellectual tradition. Of course, there are some mentions in areas of their work, Bulgakov and Florovsky, of patristic topics. Augustine comes up from time to time. So Bulgakov traces papalism and the two swords doctrine, i.e. the papacy exercising both sacred and secular power, to the conflation of the church with the city of God in Augustine. And I think he gets Augustine completely wrong here, by the way. Florovsky, more positively, in an essay on eschatology, sees Augustine's insistence on the createdness of time as an essential counterpart to Athanasius' doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And it's a development, says Florovsky, that liberates Christianity from the heritage of Hellenistic habits, especially from the fuzziness of the gap in between creator and creation, in people like Arian, people like Origen, Arius, and sotto voce Bulgakov. So says Florovsky, through Augustine, time is created, a safe foundation was laid for the Christian theology of history. But notwithstanding this rather positive passing mention of Augustine, neither Bulgakov nor Florovsky come to the question of history primarily in patristic, let alone Byzantine terms, but do so within the framework of modern Western philosophical discussions of the topic. And while they're less beholden to Augustine than their Catholic and Protestant forebears and contemporaries, neither of these Orthodox theologians have really explored what the later Greek patristic and Byzantine theological tradition, and still less the historiographical tradition, might offer to an Orthodox theology of history. I might add that a lot of modern Orthodox theological writing has been somewhat anti-historical in effect, so it's a live theological issue. But what I'm going to do today, this evening, this All Hallows Eve, is to offer a brief survey. Here we get back to Byzantium, you see. A brief survey of the Byzantine historiographical tradition for any clues that it might offer us towards the construction, the articulation of a distinctively orthodox theology of history. And I'll supplement this towards the end with some insights from a theologian I find particularly interesting in this respect, St. Maximus the Confessor. I suggest that this is a rather new approach to the question of the theology of history, and one which offers a somewhat different perspective to that which has prevailed in most Protestant, Catholic discussions of the topic, one that's not disproportionately dominated by Augustine, not disproportionately, I'm not anti-Augustine, okay? Not disproportionately dominated by Augustine, and which operates outside of the prevailing intellectual traditions of modernity, but is capable of constructive, creative dialogue with modernity, what one might even call an unmodern perspective. At a time when the modern academic discipline of history is afflicted by self-doubt as to its own purpose, its own capabilities, its own capacities, and consumed by various forms of history wars, I hope that this fresh perspective will prove constructive, not only for theologians, but also for historians. So now, having surveyed the field of modern theologies, philosophies of history, let's dive back into Byzantium, or the world of the Byzantines, or we should always call them Romans, of course. But you understand, whenever I say Byzantine, I mean Roman. They called themselves Romans. They weren't Byzantines. It's really totally wrong to call them Byzantines, but we can't really help it these days, can we? So every time I say Byzantine, think Roman. There was a story my esteemed supervisor used to tell about the Reverend Spooner in Oxford, who used to mix up his words quite a bit. And apparently he stood up in the pulpit of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford and gave a very long sermon, very detailed, and the congregation, of course, were listening attentively, but somewhat puzzled. And anyway, he went down the pulpit steps, and then he came back again and said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear people, you will understand that every time I said Aristotle, I meant our Lord Jesus Christ." So the Byzantines, or Romans, as we ought to call them, had a lot of history. Well over 1,000 years, even if we restrict ourselves only to the Christian Roman Empire down to 1453. And the Byzantines, or Romans, also wrote a great deal about it. Far more than, I believe, survives from the equivalent period in the Christian West. So the Bonn corpus of Byzantine historical texts, published in the 19th century, runs to 50 sizable volumes, and it's not entirely comprehensive by any means. There's a lot more. I mean, it doesn't include ecclesiastical histories of Eusebius, for example. So Byzantine historians wrote in direct continuity with a long tradition of Greek historiography, stretching back to Herodotus and Thucydides in the 5th century BC, often imitating their forebears in prose style, especially the Attic of Thucydides, their use of invented speeches, ethnographic and other digressions. The Byzantine historians were well aware of this pedigree, but they also operated within a very different religious and political landscape. History for the Byzantines was no longer the arena of fate, Tyche or nemesis, still less of the whims of capricious deities, but subject to the providence of the one true God. And that same providence had placed them not in the Greek city-state, but within what was, at least down to 1204 at least, a vast and multi-ethnic dominion, Rome, whose special destiny had been the subject of Greek historiography from the time of Polybius in the 2nd century BC. And this destiny of the Roman Empire was widely seen as mysteriously somehow bound up with that of the Church, in a manner quite inconceivable to the Augustinian tradition. In other words, in Byzantine historiography, we see the fruit of the coming together of these three symbolic cities I mentioned earlier, Athens, Rome, Jerusalem. It's been common when discussing Byzantine histories to distinguish between the chronicle and the history. Chronicles, shorter date-based entries, written in a lower linguistic register, often by monks. The histories in Atticizing Greek for an elite audience, covering a more limited period from a more secular perspective. But that division has since been shown to be rather too simple, with linguistic registers varying greatly in both types. Some ostensibly monkish chronicles, like that of John Zonaras in the 12th century, being rather secular in perspective, and many historiographical works containing elements of both history and chronicle. Perhaps more significance is the distinction between universal histories, histories dating back to the creation, and in principle encompassing all human history, and particular histories, pertaining to more limited periods of imperial history. In any event, it's worth noting that judging by the surviving manuscripts, for the most part it was the universal histories that were the more popular. So let me now hazard some general remarks on Byzantine historiography that can serve as pointers towards an orthodox theology of history. There are 4 of these. Firstly, Byzantine historians were very interested in truth. Not truth in an objective and empirical sense, as in some modern scientific approaches to history, but truth in terms of an ongoing and dynamic relationship with the past, experienced within the living continuum of history. Secondly, Byzantine historians fully affirmed human agency and human freedom, even under the conditions of the fall, and notwithstanding their recognition of a guiding providence. Thirdly, Byzantine historians readily accepted the intertwining of sacred and secular history. And lastly, number 4, Byzantine historians saw a particular gift of providence in the Roman Empire, but were able to refrain from absolutizing the empire as the only conceivable instrument of that providence. So I'll tease out these 4 pointers towards an orthodox theology of history in what follows, referring to some specific examples, without supposing that these elements are present in the same way through the whole corpus of Byzantine historiography. And for the sake of time, I'll just do one universal history and one particular history. So Nikitas Koniatis, who I began with, is a typical example, I think, of the latter category, a particular history. He was an historian of the last years of the Komnenos and Angelos dynasties, down to the sack of Constantinople in 1204 and its aftermath. He was a high-ranking official who witnessed many of the events he described, and left us a vivid and detailed classicizing history that was rather popular, judging by the many surviving manuscripts. And he's got an elegant preface, standard feature of classicizing history. And he says quite explicitly that the main purpose of history, you remember he's the one who says, you'd be mad if you think anything was more pleasurable than history. In his preface, he says the main purpose of history is to serve for the common benefit of mankind, since those who will are able to gather from the many histories the most advantageous of insights. And that's a commonplace, I think, of Byzantine histories. You see it in many prefaces. For example, the 7th century historian of the tragic reign of the Emperor Maurice, Theophylaximocata, who similarly said history is a delight for the ear, but educational for the soul. For in souls eager for learning, there's nothing more attractive than history. So the lessons of history, Nikitas explains, chiefly concern the exhibition of virtues, the virtues and vices of previous generations for the direct edification of the living. So the book of history is very much a morality tale, in which the freely willed human choices of the past are presented for the admonition and inspiration of contemporary readers and listeners. Similarly, Nikitas expresses the wish that the deeds and misdeeds of the past should not be allowed to vanish into oblivion, another very common trope in Byzantine histories. But when he's talking about the purpose of history, he does so with particular eloquence. History, he says, is called the book of the living, the Vivlos Zondum, the book of the living, and the written word, a clarion trumpet, like a signal from heaven, raising up those long dead and setting them before the eyes of those who desire to see them. Book of the living, we'll come back to that theme. He's reserved about the operation of divine providence in terms of direct divine intervention. He'll speak of things like dreams and comets and eagles and so forth. But he's contemptuous of astrology as deterministic. Some events, he says, happened not by chance or accident. But generally, Nikitas leaves us under no illusion that history is basically the work of free human agents. The loss of the Queen of Cities, 1204, is of course to be lamented, much as the prophet Jeremiah lamented over Jerusalem. He makes the connection explicit. This disaster, he says, is not so much the result of God's inexorable predetermination as the consequence of the incompetence and immorality of a sequence of subpar emperors, their inadequate advisors, and the fickle mob of the common people, coupled, of course, with the rapaciousness and viciousness of the Crusaders, forerunners of the Antichrist, who behave far worse than the Muslims in similar situations, he emphasizes. And this criticism of emperors we find all over the place in Byzantine histories. For Choniates, God has certainly chosen to chastise the Romans by delivering them to the barbarians. But the root cause seems to be human frailty, human greed. There's a lot of theology in Nikitas, but he has a kind of healthy agnosticism about the higher reasons behind the tragic events that it was his misfortune to live through. So towards the end of the history he writes, "O wretched author that I am, to be the keeper of such evils, and now to grace with the written word the misfortunes of my family and my countrymen." The history was unfinished at his death around 1217. It's doubtful, I think, that he could have drawn any very definite conclusions about God's ongoing purposes for the Roman Empire, now reduced to a set of competing claimants for the imperial mantle in exile. While he continued to see the world as basically divided between Romans and barbarians, he's not above giving some positive coverage to the Latin emperors of Constantinople, or indeed to acknowledging some of the mistreatment doled out to the Latins before 1204, including the infamous massacre of 1182. So a late piece dealing with events around 1206 strikes a very melancholy tone in speaking about the death-dealing and destruction that makes so much of human history a story of nations killing and being killed, perishing by the power of Christ, who scatters those nations who wish for wars and does not delight in bloodshed. But why some should perish and some should prevail is a matter ultimately known only to God, whom he calls the maker and pilot of the terrestrial ship. And I think Choniates is fairly typical for Byzantine histories in terms of his stress on human agency under a definite but ultimately inscrutable providence. Other sources might be more or less ready to assign particular events to direct divine action, but the basic pattern is fairly consistent. That doesn't happen very often. So now for a typical example of universal history, the history of George Synkelos. It's a 9th century work by a monk and high-ranking ecclesiastical official who served under Patriarch Tarasios, who was Patriarch of Constantinople at the time of the 7th Ecumenical Council in 787. So George's work is dedicated to establishing a uniform chronology, embracing in principle all human history, going right back to the creation, and dating the incarnation, by which he means the Annunciation, the conception, to Sunday, the 25th of March in the year 5501, Anno Mundi. The resurrection is dated to the same day, the same date, Sunday 25th of March, 5534. 25th of March, in his understanding, corresponds to the first day of the Jewish month Nisan, also the first day of creation, which took place in, of course, Anno Mundi 1. The day of the opening of Noah's Ark is also established as Anno Mundi 2234. And in a real sense for George, these days are all the same day. All the same day. The Ark, the Incarnation, the Resurrection, the Creation. And all this, he says, is established on the basis of Scripture and the best historical sources. And he includes Maximus here, and we'll talk about him a bit later. But most of all, says George, it's on the basis of his trust in God, the timeless author of time. And what's significant about the text is not its strict historical accuracy in terms of events and chronology. As with Nicetas, that's hardly the point of Byzantine history. His work rather seeks to enact a theology of time in which those in the present, including us, can be brought into a living relationship with the whole sweep of human history. And in this process, the past and the future, the heretofore and the hereafter, are brought together in the eternal here and now of the kingdom. Now, George was neither the first nor the last to attempt universal history. In fact, he only gets up to the reign of Diocletian in the 3rd century. Somebody else, Theophanes, continued it. But George's work was widely admired for its scholarship and summation of earlier traditions, notwithstanding its rather sprawling nature. A recent study called it the most influential historical text ever written in medieval Constantinople. It's a pious work that deplores earlier commentators like Eusebius, who were prepared to cast doubt on biblical chronology and question received tradition. Indeed, George's presentation of a unified and consistent chronology for all human history was an important factor behind the fact that his chronography displaced that of Eusebius as a template for subsequent universal histories. So we're talking about Eusebius's chronicle here, not his ecclesiastical history. But while the hand of God hovers over all human history for George, instances of direct divine intervention are rare. Human history very much still the work of human agency. And it's there to bring to life the agents of the past, as in Nicetas, for the edification of the living. So these universal histories are structured first and foremost by biblical history, but they also deal with the rise and fall of various empires and kingdoms. And one of the results of this is this intertwining of sacred and secular history I spoke about a moment ago. So, for example, George presents King David as a contemporary of Homer and Hesiod, while other texts, such as the very popular and lively, slightly later chronicle of Constantine Mathews in the 11th century, even have David regretfully turning down a plea from King Priam to go and help. Sorry, I can't come. I've got my own, I've got my own concerns. I've got my own worries. I can't come. These universal histories pay particular attention to the rise and expansion of Rome. See that especially in that of John Zonaras. Ancient Greece, by comparison, receives relatively little attention. It's all about Rome. Some histories explain George the Monk, George Kedrenos, that the gods and goddesses we hear about, Zeus and Hera and so forth, were simply rulers, kings and queens of past times. There's a lot of energy in these universal histories, explaining the connection between the emergence of the empire under Augustus and the divine incarnation, something also celebrated in Byzantine hymns for the Nativity. It's not a coincidence that Christ is born just at the moment then Augustus brings the whole Mediterranean world under one ruler. This is something that someone like Karl Lerwith, who I think comes from much more Protestant perspective, says is completely irrelevant. The incarnation, he says quite explicitly, could have happened at any time. No particular reason it needed to be under Augustus. So there's a real sense of the potentialities of secular history to serve as a vehicle for the more important truths of sacred history in these universal histories. But although they saw a providential role for the Roman Empire, this is very much part of God's purposes, they, I suggest, refrained from absolutizing the empire. In other words, they could conceive of a world, of a church, without the empire. And I think that's tremendously significant. So having teased out these four characteristics of Byzantine historiography, so the interest in truth, but in terms of this direct living relationship, human agency, intertwining of sacred and secular history, gift of providence in the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire not the be-all and end-all. Let's go, for the last part of the lecture, to something of a higher plane. And St. Maximus the Confessor, who of course graces the very nice poster that was produced for this talk. So, time of Maximus. 7th century and the 8th century are, interestingly, a kind of dark age for Byzantine historiography. Very few surviving histories. 2 from the 7th, Maximus's time, none in the 8th, according to Leonora Neville's count. And the great showdown, the titanic showdown with the Persians under Heraclius, the onslaught of Islam, the infamy, the iconoclast period conspired to produce a period that's nearly destitute of historical sources. And in fact, some of the historical documents about Maximus, for example, his trial, are actually some of the most important historical documents that we have from this period. Now, Maximus isn't tremendously interested in human history for its own sake, but of course he has to. He could hardly fail to not discuss, or at least not mention, the rise of Islam and the loss of many of the eastern provinces of the empire to Islam in quick succession. Just as soon as they got them back from the Persians and restored the cross to Jerusalem, suddenly it's all lost again to the armies of Islam. And he has some very harsh things to say about the barbaric inhabitants of the desert sweeping over a foreign land and so forth. The advances of Islam for Maximus can only be a result of human sin, and he makes it quite clear in one of his letters that the particular sin he's thinking about is wavering in matters of faith. So he's clearly talking in context about the Monothelite controversy. So this attempt, some of the Roman emperor of the time, Heraclius, his patriarch Sergius and others, to reunite the Miaphysites to the imperial church by insisting that there's only one will in Christ. And of course Maximus gave, really, his life for his defense of the integrity of Christ's human nature. And for a human nature to be a properly human nature, it needs a will. It needs to be able to act. So Maximus does make a connection between the advances of Islam and hesitancy in matters of faith, particularly this Monothelite heresy. Of course, he himself was accused for his resistance to monothelitism, which was actually for a while doing quite well in building some bridges, getting some of the Miaphysites back into the imperial church, as having single-handedly, this is at his trial in 655, delivered the whole East to the armies of Islam. And even when his theology is canonized at the 6th Ecumenical Council, he is not mentioned. So, but the last sort of text I want to talk about is his Questions to Thalassius 22. So, Questions to Thalassius, he's dealing with all sorts of tricky bits of scripture, or pieces of scripture that don't seem to make much sense when put together. 65 questions in all. So at number 22, he's dealing with the apparent contradiction between two texts, Ephesians 2:7, Corinthians 10:11. And this brings us to the part of the title. So the question is, if God in the coming ages will show his riches, how is it that the ends of the ages have come upon us? So this is a cue for Maximus to display his exegetical flair, but he produces thereby a very fertile theology of history. As is typical for him, he offers multiple overlapping interpretations, all orbiting around the now and not yet dialectic of the Gospels. So in the first instance, he divides the ages into two. So the ends of the ages must pertain to the accomplished mystery of the incarnation, and the coming ages to the ongoing mystery of human deification, or theosis. To state the matter briefly, says Maximus, he's not always very good at stating the matter briefly, it must be said. So it's a bit like, particularly in Greece, I find, when a professor stands up and says, hey, mate, polysyntemos, I'll be very short. At least go on for 15 minutes or longer. Anyway, Maximus, he's going to be very brief, and I'm going to be very brief, because we're getting towards the end. The former belongs to God's descent to man, and the latter to man's ascent to God. So, coming ages is about deification, the ends of the ages about the incarnation. That's happened, deification is to come. Another suggestion he makes, maybe it refers to activity and passivity. So activity is about the time of incarnation, passivity is about human beings experiencing, passively, deification. But in between these two interpretations, he offers what I think is the key insight, and I'm going to leave you with this key insight, a very fruitful basis for an orthodox theology of history. Or rather, he says, since our Lord Jesus Christ is the beginning, middle, and end of all the ages, past, present, and future, one could say that through the power of faith, the end of the ages, I mean that end which will be actualized by grace, according to its proper form, in the deification of the worthy, has already come upon us, And Paul Blowers, in a very nice article on this, talks about this as a realized eschatology. Now, the end of this lecture has come upon us, but I want to leave you with a vision of what I take to be a distinctively orthodox theology of history as the arena of divine human synergia, cooperation, synergy, founded upon the incarnation, in which all of human history, events, societies, cultures, civilizations, wars, famines, plagues, peace, plenty, all of it has the capacity, under the providence, to serve as the occasion for man's salvation, or the contrary. So salvation history and world history are mysteriously intertwined. There's no such thing as merely human history. Rather, each and every event teeters on the brink of absolute value and absolute insignificance, in accordance as it facilitates or hinders free human agents from accepting the promises of the gospel, from accepting the promise of deification. The end of history is not at some distant point in the future, but deep down inside each and every moment. As Leopold von Ranke remarked, all ages are equidistant from eternity. All ages are equidistant from eternity. Thus, each and every moment of time is the acceptable time, the time of salvation, the time of deification. Deification being precisely the end of the ages. And what can I say now but the end? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Plested. We do have a little time for questions. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes if you're willing to. Would you like to field your own questions?
Okay.
We already
Thank you, Marcus, for a very rich lecture. I always resented when people ask two questions, because you should only ask one question. But I really have two questions.
Okay.
So, but you can answer either of them, or actually none of them. But the first question is, you know, your first feature of what you call Byzantine.
Roman. Roman. That's Romans.
Roman, that's right. Which is Arabic too. We say Rum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, so the first one is, that first criterion is truth as living relation with the past, something like that. So why do you associate living relation with truth as such? The second one is, like, how would you apply your vision of history, which ends up being fairly positive, I would say. But, you know, how would you apply that to I would say, like, realistic pessimism? Like, you know, that it's fairly, I think it's pretty realistic to think that, you know, there's a good chance the world will end badly, whether by nuclear holocaust or environmental catastrophe or something like that. And would your fairly positive vision of history be able to somehow make theological sense of that? Sort of like history culminating in complete catastrophe?
Yeah, yes, the new catastrophe. So truth as living relation. Well, this is my attempt to make sense of these constant protestations about truth. And clearly from our point of view, insofar as we're kind of imbued in modern approaches to history, and we think it's probably quite important that dates are right, or people are in the right order, this kind of thing. Clearly the Byzantine histories vary in their quality from that strictly sort of modern historical point of view. And do they really think they've got everything right? I mean, what do they mean when they say, my discourse is going to be all about truth? And it just seems to me that, you know, looking at some of these prefaces, when they're talking about truth, it's not, I've got everything right, I've done this, I've done that, but there is a truth that will come through to the attentive reader if the attentive reader really, you know, responds to the vices and virtues of the past and makes it you know, part of their own way of life. So that's the truth. I mean, you might say it's truth operating more on a kind of level of morality and way of life, but certainly not in terms of strict historical accuracy. I mean, that's my attempt to tease out what they mean when they say my account is a truthful one, because it pertains to following the one who is the way, the truth, and life, and so forth. Well, do I have a positive account? I hoped I wasn't being too positive. I mean, what I didn't want to is just dismiss human history as sort of adventitious and irrelevant. And I think you do see that in some approaches. I mean, forgive me if there are any strict Barthians here, but I do see that in Barth. Karl Lerwith is a brilliant thinker. I mean, I found his Meaning in History also an important source for Florovsky, tremendously helpful. But yes, the ability to sort of completely dismiss human history. The incarnation could have happened at any time. It really didn't matter. All human events are essentially of no interest to the Christian. It's only about individual salvation, essentially. So I wanted a positive view of history in terms of history mattering, but I certainly didn't want to give the impression that there's anything particularly pleasant about human history, or things aren't normally really bad. And when I gave a list towards the end of various awful things. Yes, wars, famines, plagues. I suppose I did end with peace and plenty. But but yeah, it is mostly bad. And in terms of Augustine, yes, a pedagogy of suffering. I mean, I want to embrace that. I want to embrace Augustine's view of history here. As I said, it's not an anti-Augustinian project, but I just want to sort of balance it with some, perhaps more positive approach insofar as actual events and societies potentially mattering. I think that's what I was going at. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Well, this is sort of a follow-up, and I'm afraid there's kind of two parts to my observations as well. I think on the face of it, and let's start with Augustine. This is dominating, I think, the whole discussion, really. All of the various people, and I agree with you with Loeth, is brilliant, absolutely brilliant book and so on. All of the Western interpretations, it depends how you're interpreting Augustine. And one thing that's very clear in Augustine, history is the result of precisely human agency of the human will. Now the question becomes is how is the human will,
in a bad way,
in relationship to the influence of divine grace.
Yes.
So there's nothing, and that's why he can have the realistic vision, for example, that how corrupt emperors and kings have a much more devastating effect, because as we see in our own world, their wills can dominate and extend far further. So this is a very important question, and so you mentioned this in principle at the beginning of your lecture, that whatever difference there's going to be between a Byzantine theology of history and one dominated by Augustine is going to be precisely in their to be found in their different views, it seems to me, at least in Augustine's of nature and grace, and how it affects the human will. So it's going to, it's inseparable. And essentially what you see with all these modern people, and Loeth actually brings this to bear, is, if you deny original sin, if you read the great books on the Enlightenment, I'm forgetting the fellow who went to Yale, the Jewish German historian who went to Yale, and so on. His name slips me. He says that the whole project of the Enlightenment was to somehow get rid of original sin. Because if Pascal was still correct, all of their enterprise couldn't even get off the ground. So that theological concept is something that has to be overcome in order to come to modern views.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly not suggesting that the Orthodoxy doesn't have original sin and doesn't think that human agency is severely compromised. But there is just there's something there.
Yeah.
It's the classic image of the sick person on their bed being able to ask for help, whereas Augustine's understanding is much more the man taken by thieves on the road to Jericho. But I do want, the main point is to put Augustine in this kind of broader patristic stroke Byzantine context, rather than his being the only voice. But I take your point about Augustine and the will, absolutely.
Two other quick points. of course, there are even medieval Christian, Latin Christian
Yes.
competitors to philosophy's history.
Yeah.
Joachim is the major one.
Yes.
And you
yes.
see that, and if you look at Dante and his
Yeah.
view, for example,
Yeah.
I mean, the whole business about Augustus and the right time and so on taking off from Luca, he takes this as divine revelation
Yeah.
and the providence of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can even find passages in chapter 4 of the City of God where Augustine says pretty much the same thing on that point.
Yeah, it's not an easy contrast, is it, in either case? But
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Somebody just there, yes?
I wonder if it would be helpful, you mentioned Ratzinger, and
Yes.
he has written quite extensively on Bonaventure's
Yes.
Theology of History.
Yes.
Would you find that helpful?
Well, absolutely, and he's particularly dealing with Joachim
Yeah.
as well, and I think this is, it's a tremendously important work, and it's certainly part of a broader project. Yeah, thank you. Somebody at the back there?
Yes, so thank you. That was a very thought-provoking lecture. Maybe to follow up with Father Anatolios' question in a more specific vein, you mentioned how a lot of like universal histories and more literary histories are imitating Thucydides' Attic style.
Well, actually, it's more the particular histories.
Oh, the particular,
yeah.
excuse me, particular
Yeah.
histories, but
But it's not entirely
oh, okay, sorry.
consistent,
Well, anyway,
yeah.
Thucydides' style is being imitated,
Yeah.
but in terms of the narrative form of Thucydides, one of the fascinating things is history is very much a tragedy.
Yeah.
Right, whereas if you want, broadly spoken, like a positive account of history, right, you want to maybe out-narrate this account of history as a tragedy.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in any of the histories you looked at, did you see any kind of attempt to, say, out-narrate this sort of idea that, well, history is always going to end up tragic because Constantinople is going to get sacked and these little successor empire or kingdoms in Anatolia and the Balkans are going to squabble and never be able to retake
But
Constantinople?
it's mostly pretty bad.
That's what it's like.
And even when you have emperors who do good things, they're undermined. There are problems. There's, and to be honest, sometimes it is just is it Henry Ford? One thing after another, and all those things are mostly pretty bad. And in say Choniatis, you have some emperors who are better than others. In Anna Komnena, you have hero emperors, but also more problematic forces and military disasters and so forth. So the Byzantine histories are, particularly the particular histories, I would say, sometimes there's a particular reason why a particular emperor would be exalted as the best emperor ever. But much of it is pretty tragic. Theophylact Simocato on the Emperor Maurice, it's almost has the form of a tragedy. There are all sorts of portents and things that the Emperor Maurice does wrong, and it was all kind of foretold. So yeah, it can be pretty depressing. And of course, it's not kind of nemesis or fate or as such, but the way it reads can be not dissimilar to
So they are
Thucydides.
taking the narrative form
To some extent, yes. But please.
Was a particularly cheerful.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Particularly cheerful thinking about how the world might end horribly.
Mm.
But normally when I do history, I
Mm.
talk about things that have already happened,
Mm.
as opposed to the future. For a theological perspective on history to be consistent,
Mhm.
does it sort of necessitate the future?
Yes.
Is it important to think about the future
Yeah,
to do history?
absolutely. We have to, I don't know if you've seen the recent book by Metropolitan John Cezullas, Remembering the Future, which is, I think, a very powerful work of eschatology, but using eschatology to understand human history. So, of course, we need to remember the future. Because theology of history is really about, well, how does eternity and time interact? And clearly that involves past, present, and future.
Does this relate at all to how the last book of the Bible is written?
Yes, well, that's a big thing. Bulgakov particularly gets some of his, what I would call his theology of history from Revelation, including some sort of historical millennium that's going to come.
Okay.
So,
And is it possible for there to be a theologically consistent and satisfying history that could end any way it wants? Tomorrow there could be purple elephants, and that wouldn't affect how you think of the world.
Well, I think I want to say no to that. The idea of the purple elephants, but it's not all random. And the universal histories, although you might think it's always laughable that they have the same day and date for creation, incarnation, resurrection, and so forth. But I think there's something quite interesting going on about the relationship between eternity and time. But there's always this sense of the inscrutability of divine providence. And, if even the Son of God himself can say, I do not know when the end of the world will be, then we certainly shouldn't be presuming about big elephants or what have you. But thank you. I think, sorry, there's somebody who wanted to come in here.
Thank you for the talk. With using Maximus's paradigm of
Yes.
creation or history as an opportunity of theosis, let's say, do you think, you mentioned a couple of categories of history in Byzantium, the chronicle versus history, the universal versus the particular. Would you add to that kind of a more ecclesiastical versus a political history? I know that's a difficult distinction to make in Byzantium.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have Eusebius and his continuators, but then that's my alarm. You have Eusebius and his continuators doing a distinct sort of ecclesiastical history, but with the establishment of the Christian empire, ecclesiastical history kind of becomes redundant insofar as the church and the empire are intimately bound up in the way in which I've been speaking about. You do get the odd ecclesiastical history. I think Simeon of Thessalonica writes something along those lines. But basically, ecclesiastical history as a distinct discipline dies out because it's not needed anymore. But I still think it's important for a theology of history. And what Eusebius has to say about the providential place of the Roman Empire, for example, and you can compare that to, say, Lactantius' reaction to the Christian Empire.
Where would you place the Synaxarion within that?
I think that should be maybe I'll do a chapter on the Synaxarion, but that will have to wait, I'm afraid. But that's certainly living out this interaction of eternity and time. The lives of the saints would be a great place to look.
We have, I think, come to the end, but only in one sense. In another sense, the end is not yet, because we had a beautiful reception, I think, waiting for us through that door, and we can continue with conversation with Professor Plested through the evening. So please join me in thanking Professor Plested once again.
So come on through, make your way to the studies room. Behind us, and then you'll find
This summer, my wife and I went to